charitable giving during presidential election years and the impact of other world events. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the Fundraising School, and I'm joined today by my longtime colleague, Dr. Patrick Rooney. Patrick is Professor Emeritus of Economics and Philanthropy at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And Patrick, what a delight to have you back on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Bill, thanks for having me.
Patrick is a pioneer in researching charitable behavior. He's recognized nationally and internationally for this work. And he is one of the folks that I always say, like, he's taught me a lot of what I know, but not yet everything he knows. And that's a never-ending process, including, Patrick, a question we always get every time there's a presidential election year in the United States. How does the vast amount of contributions to the presidential candidates affect charitable giving to nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, Bill, so I joined the Center on Philanthropy at the time as Director of Research in 1999, and we had a presidential election year coming up shortly thereafter. And so this is a question I've gotten many years or many election cycles, and the answer each time has been that it really does not have a material effect on philanthropic giving. And many people are surprised by this because every year what we see is that each presidential cycle generally sets a record for the most dollars spent on presidential campaigns. And so, there's always been a concern about, will this displace or crowd out philanthropic giving? And so we've looked at this a number of times, and very consistently, I just looked up the 2020 data last night and going back historically as well, just to confirm this trend. But again, even though 2020 was a record amount spent by quite a bit, in part because so many Democratic candidates were in the hunt, at least early in the election. And so the Democratic Party spent, 3 or 4 times as much as they had in any other election. And so, which was a little surprising, it would have that big of an impact. And yet, nonetheless, total presidential spending divided by total giving is less than 1 percentage point. And total presidential spending as a share of total household giving is just over 1%. And so you can see, like, we've done statistical tests to see if this matters, holding everything else constant statistically, and we find this to be consistently inconsistent. Consistently non-significant. And the reason is, again, it's just such a small fraction of total giving or household giving that it doesn't really move the needle one way or the other. And so I think also psychologically, if I'm making my philanthropic gifts, I'm using one part of my heart and brain about how and why and where I'm donating. And if I'm making a gift to a presidential campaign, I'm using a different part of my heart and brain. And, granted, people are budget constrained, but the amount of money generally going to the presidential campaigns is so small relative to the amount of money going to philanthropic campaigns that it really does not cause a reallocation of funds.
And when we look at the Giving USA data from one year to the next, one of my favorites is that bar chart and line graph that shows the last 40 years. And when you look at the presidential years, charitable giving goes up each presidential year after adjusting for inflation, except once, and that's 2008, which had nothing to do with Senators Obama and McCain and everything to do with the Great Recession that hit in
Correct.
September. So the numbers back you up. Patrick, and you mentioned the important psychological factor that's at play here. What about somebody who says, oh, I have a chance to elect the first woman as president, or the first non-white person as vice president, or the first person who publicly identifies as LGBTQAI plus as Mayor Buttigieg, now Secretary Buttigieg did when he was a primary candidate. Well, I want to see him in the White House for that demographic reason as well. Might people, if they have their philanthropic support in similar types of causes, shift their money to charitable giving? Or again, do we not see that?
So, yeah, Bill, I think that's a really important gradation that, might matter for, 1 or 2 or 10 individuals, right? And so, what we're looking at is total presidential spending and total philanthropic giving. And so, some of those granular, micro level changes may do get washed out in the overall trend data. But it's certainly possible that, if, Warren Buffett, somebody who's giving away a lot of money every year, or Bill Gates, or somebody who says, I'm going to reallocate all my philanthropic giving this year, other than what I'm required to by law because it's in a foundation. If I reallocate all that money, you could see that that might have a swing for that individual. And if it's someone who's a large enough donor, we might talk about it. But again, it's really probably not going to change the numbers in the aggregate. And that, the total giving numbers are not likely to go down, even if, some of the biggest donors stepped aside. And most likely, the people who are in the billionaire group, and I'm not yet a member of that club and probably never will be, but I can't imagine that even if I wanted to have as much influence as I could in the political equation, that it wouldn't change my calculus for giving philanthropically. And so I don't see, I see the psychology of it, but I don't see it causing a big enough shift that we would notice it in the overall trend data.
So just again, generally speaking, macro level, the answer is no. Presidential campaigns do not negatively affect charitable giving in a typical presidential election year. Patrick, you mentioned your first year at the center was 1999. So your first presidential election year was the year 2000, the year of the hanging Chad and all of that controversy that unfolded. And what we've seen since, and what you may or may not have research on this, but you follow this so closely, what we seem to see more and more is my side lost, so I'm going to donate to specific nonprofits sort of in protest. My side won, so I'm actually going to make some donations out of celebration. Usually the protest side, though, the so-called rage donations, do you see that affecting charitable giving, where maybe I'm also sad that one side lost, but I'm not the one receiving the extra charitable giving because I don't fit into that particular category? What kind of guidance can you give us in that regard?
So as a fundraiser, I think we should exploit, in a good sense, every opportunity that comes along. And I think that's happened in, more recent elections, right? And I would expect that to happen again, right? So in the 2024 election, one side is going to, encourage rage giving if they win of one type, and the other side will encourage rage giving the other type. And while this makes the headlines in the Chronicle and other, philanthropic outlets, and possibly the New York Times or the Washington Post and so on, but for the most part, this is, kind of very individualistic and small dollars. Like there's a few charities that they get a blip for a year, but that's a reallocation perhaps of philanthropic giving, or some extra dollars going to philanthropic giving, but it doesn't move the needle of total giving in a meaningful way up or down. And while, certain charities may find, they're getting more or less dollars in a given year, that's really not going to affect the overall philanthropic landscape.
And that's so well said when we also think about, at the fundraising school, we teach not just the one gift, but that ongoing relationship with the donor, which just for human dignity reasons, because they're a donor, let alone we want those recurring gifts, hopefully, that might even increase over time, not just that one gift, however large it might be in response to an election. Patrick, the issue of elections and the results of elections fits into this broader category of world events. And I know you've done a lot of study in this as well. But there's the war in Ukraine, there's the war in the Middle East. As we record this, it's tornado season in the Midwestern part of the United States. Our friends in the South and Southeast will be encountering hurricane season yet again later on in the calendar year. And of course, we see wonderful outpouring of generosity when these unfortunate tragedies strike. Again, how does that affect everyday charitable giving if I'm not one of those nonprofits on the receiving end when there is a world event or a national catastrophe?
Yeah, Bill, and this is really fascinating, and it's there's not a simple answer, not one size fits all, but the general answer is, like for the presidential election campaigns, that these disasters, whether natural or man-made, tend not to affect overall giving, with a few exceptions. Generally, I would say that we have pretty well chronicled that man-made events, wars, and other things like that, tend not to make a noticeable difference in the total amounts given. The war in Ukraine, clearly, a tragic set of circumstances for the Ukrainians, and I'm sure there was some philanthropic giving that came, especially at the beginning. I don't know how much of that has continued and how sustainable that is. Even though, like following earthquakes in Haiti and, tsunamis and so on, there's the initial hots and cots response, right? Providing hot meals and a place for shelter. And that's usually quite large. But what we find is that within 6 months, all the giving that goes to a disaster has happened. Usually 4 months, but always within 6 months, it is just leveled off and just dissipates. So, for man-made disasters, we generally see that, one distinction was, the amount of money given to 9/11, following 9/11 was pretty remarkable. And that happened from corporations, households, and foundations. And so, we saw a blip of, we studied 911 giving quite a bit. We saw a blip in total giving from that. But at the same time, the economy was pushing things down because 911 did two things, right? It stimulated this disaster-related giving, but it also stimulated a small recession. And so that caused a downdraft in total giving. If you look at the tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, and so on, what we see is that most Americans reported giving something at all to Katrina and to most other domestic type large natural disasters. The small one, the tornado in Tornado Alley, that generates some local support, but it doesn't generate national support. The tsunami, about 1/3 of Americans donated to the Asian tsunami. But in each of those cases that I mentioned, 9/11, Katrina, the tsunami, what we found in surveys that we did with other partners was that whether it was a domestic one with 2/3 giving or the international one with 1/3 giving, that the median gift in all those cases was $50. And the mean gift was between $125 and $135. So you can see that, a lot of people got on and they made a gift, $25 to $100, and the median was 50. And they said, I did my thing and moved on. Now they had a philanthropic response, and collectively it was a lot of dollars, right? But, your gift of $50 to $100, my gift of $50 to $100 is not going to shift philanthropic giving away from, you don't stop tithing to your, mass mosque synagogue. You don't stop giving to your alma mater because you gave a $25 to $100 gift to the American Red Cross or United Way or Salvation Army and things like that, other disaster relief organizations. And so we found really no evidence for any displacement. And I say that both when you look at the raw numbers, you're like, okay, this doesn't make sense. And we look at the aggregate numbers of Giving USA, but we also did regression analysis using these interventions as a data point to say, was there a shift from this intervention? And we find conclusively that there's no evidence for a shift as a result of these natural or man-made disasters.
Patrick, I'm so glad you emphasized that point, because when those events happen, what gets the headlines, understandably so, is that millionaire, that billionaire, that big corporation, that one of the biggest legacy foundations makes that huge 7-figure gift. People listen to this podcast often, or who I've taught in courses. I always bring up Damar Hamlin, the young man from the Buffalo Bills, and his crowdfunding raised about $10 million after that incident in Cincinnati. And, of course, the headline is, the star quarterback who made the big gift and the team owner who made the big gift. The average gift was about $40. So It's a both and we don't always hear about the $40. As we conclude, Patrick, as I think about this in a broader category, it seems to me this is yet another example why fundraisers need to have an abundance mentality, not a scarcity mentality, even with the different philosophical reasons why people might give to a presidential candidate or in a response to the outcome of an election or these man-made and natural disasters. that fundraisers, even in a presidential election year, or even when that natural disaster hits, can still have that abundance mentality, that growth mentality, that sense of possibility, as opposed to thinking it's an either or, a binary choice for a lot of individuals.
Yeah, Bill, I think that's so important. I mean, I think if you're a pessimist and you're a fundraiser, you need to find a new job and quickly. And I think the other thing I would say is that what we have seen in good days and in bad days, even in the worst of days during the Great Recession and so on, giving went down, but it didn't go to zero. It didn't go anywhere close to that. It went down for 2 years, and that was unprecedented. But the Great Recession was unprecedented, right? And so, philanthropy is a core American value, and we see that it has a very persistent effect. It doesn't go away. We may modify how much we give, where we give, why we give on a year-to-year basis, but it's very rare that we see that people just say, I'm not going to give this year, of those who are giving. Now, sometimes, bad events happen. You get laid off or you go through a divorce and so on. And there may be a temporary disruption in your giving patterns. But what we see is, 4 years after a divorce, there is a decline, by the way, following a divorce in giving, household giving. But within 4 years, they're back up to where they were status quo ante, right? So they had this material, emotional, financial dislocation, and yet philanthropy is a core American value. Within 4 years, they're giving as much as they were before they got divorced. And so I think that these disasters and the business cycle all play a role. These are things that get the headlines. These are the things that we talk about because on the margin, we worry about them when we talk about them. But what we see is a very persistent philanthropic value at least among Americans, that giving persists throughout the business cycle, giving persists throughout disasters, and giving persists throughout individual conflicts, injustices, bad luck, and so on.
Patrick, thank you for sharing your expertise, as well as that guidance of encouragement in the context of your expertise. And we have these conversations in our courses, 24 public courses in all. We're now in 10 U.S. cities in person, and of course, in the United States and across the world online, either virtual, meaning live, or asynchronous, meaning recorded. We can also customize training just for you, your nonprofit, your association, your region, again, in person, online, anywhere across the globe. We have our quarterly webinars and, of course, these weekly podcasts. And our knowledge is gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now out in the 5th edition. All of this is available on our website. Now, get a pen. It's a long URL because we're part of a big university. It's philanthropy.indianapolis.iu.edu/the fundraising school. Thanks again to our guest, Dr. Patrick Rooney, the Professor Emeritus of Economics and Philanthropy at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and a podcast produced by my colleagues Mike Anthony and Jennifer Boffman. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.